Hello, welcome to Leverton on Politics. I'm your host, Adam, and on this podcast, I just rant and give you my political opinion. Who am I? Just an average guy with average opinions about the world. Today's topic is going to be Trump versus Canada. And I think I will do a full length episode on Trump himself and the whole kind of Trump phenomenon. But in this particular episode, I'd like to focus on Trump and Canada, as he said that Canada should become the 51st state. And according to Justin Trudeau, he's not really joking about this. He really feels that this is something that he wants. So in this episode, I'll tell you why Trump wants Canada, how he could actually go about doing that, and I will give you the Canadian reaction to these plans. So, first of all, let me be clear about my biases in this situation. I am Canadian, I was born in Canada, but I've lived a long time in other countries. Never the United States, but in other countries. So I have a bit of a different perspective on it than Canadians may have. Yes, so the first topic, why does Trump want Canada? He wants Canada it's kind of complicated. It's complicated because Donald Trump generally doesn't understand trade deals. You could make the argument that he understands one aspect of business, but just because you are a good businessman, not saying that Donald Trump is a good businessman, but just because you understand one aspect of the business world doesn't mean that you understand all aspects of the business world. In pre-Trump existence in North America, there was something called the North America Free Trade Act or Agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement. And this was between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And what it basically permitted was that the Americans got access to cheap natural resources from Canada, cheap human resources from Mexico, and that actually enriched them. And you could say that in terms of Canada, this deal was, beneficial, because I think free trade is generally beneficial for societies, because the easier it is for you to start a business and expand that business internationally, it's better for you from terms of business. But in terms of independence, economic independence, not great for Canada. There was this NAFTA agreement, and also what it allowed was sort of illegal immigration coming from Mexico. And this illegal immigration kind of propped up the American economy a great deal. But then there was a reaction to this, which was in part funded by the Russians, but that's going to be a topic for a different episode, because yeah, I know. You're like, what? What do you mean it was funded by the Russians? So the Russians, around 2014, they lost control of Ukraine, and they invaded the eastern part of Ukraine. And they thought to themselves, and this has probably been going on much earlier than that, but they thought to themselves, how can we to be honest, a third-rate military power with nuclear weapons, how can we influence the world in the way that we want it to? They did a lot of internet campaigns, social media campaigns, just to try and stir things up. And one of the things that they really focused on was this immigration topic. because of the war in Syria, I know I'm going all over the place, but because of the war in Syria, there was a lot of refugees that went to Europe. And so it was very easy in Europe to have this kind of like knee jerk reaction like refugees are horrible, they're like rapists, they're criminals, they're terrorists, we can't trust them. And that kind of thinking the Russians promoted in the United States, where immigrants are not really a terrorist problem in the United States, and also, unless you count the fact of illegal immigration being a crime in itself, they're not actually criminals, right? And actually, being an illegal immigrant in the United States is not a felony, it's a misdemeanor. So it's a light version of a crime. Like you would get a fine for it if you weren't deported. Being deported is the felony part. Interesting. So there was this reaction that was provoked and promoted by the Russians, this anti-immigrant reaction, and it was building and building and building. And Trump came along, and he is a brilliant politician on the one hand and an absolute moron on the other hand. But Trump came along and he saw that there was this basically racist reaction against immigrants, and he thought, how can I use that? And he played it beautifully. So he was elected in his first term. Now, back to the trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. There was an influx of Mexicans into the United States, which did prop up the economy, but eventually that led to a backlash among lower educated people who felt that this immigration was bad for America because they were stealing their jobs and, all of that stuff, even though those two things are not really connected. Trump looks at the situation in 2016 and he sees that Canada is selling far more things than they're buying from the United States. And Mexico, same situation, selling a lot more things than they're buying from the United States. Now there's two very obvious reasons for that. The first reason, Mexico is a lot poorer than the United States, so they don't have as much money to spend on American products as Americans do on Mexican products. And in Canada's case, I would say the average Canadian might be a little bit poorer than the average American, but probably it's equal, and maybe the average Canadian is a little bit richer than the average American because of, healthcare. The thing is, there's far less Canadians. So that's the nature of the trade imbalance. So he gets together this great new trade deal, the best trade deal he's ever seen. I forgot what it was called, US CATA, whatever. But basically, it was NAFTA with Trump branding, right? That's all. NAFTA with Trump branding. Trump does a bunch of shady stuff in his first term in office, and the pandemic happens, and he becomes historically unpopular. So he loses the election. He pretends that he doesn't lose the election, and there is almost a coup d'etat in the United States with the January 6th people trying to stop this deal, as it were. But that's all like domestic politics. But it's important for our story, and this is all still why Trump wants Canada. So he should have retired. Honestly, he should have retired after that. But for whatever reason, all of these criminal trials against him kind of really dragged on. And partly it was his team, but I think maybe the people should have been a little more forceful in pursuing those avenues of legal action against Trump, because he did break a bunch of laws. And I think, again, so nobody expected him. Well, in 2016, it was a really close race, but people didn't really expect him to win, but he won. And then again, after, I guess, this year, 2024, or last year, people also didn't really expect him to win, and the Democrats didn't expect him to win, which was a big mistake, because, of course, he won. And he won for multiple reasons. And it's kind of crazy now that people are saying that, oh, well, Musk, he manipulated the election and that's why Trump won. Trump won, in my opinion, because he has this loyal group which will vote for him no matter what he does. And that's not the majority of Americans. And then the other part of the Americans who voted for him, they believed this propaganda that the American media portrays that, life under Biden is so bad, inflation was so high, and bring back Trump, and oh baby, everything will be great again. Trump's, apart from anti-immigration policy, building the wall and stuff, which we don't hear about this term. Wonder why? I don't know. Apart from that, his other platform was like, yeah, we're going to have tariffs on everything, tariffs on every country, 50% tariffs on goods from Europe, 80% tariffs on goods from China, and, so on and so forth. And if you don't understand how tariffs work, it's a bit of a complicated topic, but basically these are taxes on imports into your country. And they do have a benefit, which is when you have a small industry that you want to protect. But generally, if your industry is very well developed, it's not actually going to help that industry. Trump's argument for it is because, it will raise revenue and maybe we can get rid of the income tax, which, his rich friends will really enjoy. So, yeah, so these tariffs are supposed to, in his mind, although he's never explained it so clearly, in his mind, they're supposed to help Americans, help American manufacturing, and punish countries that have the audacity to sell things to Americans. And the country that has the biggest audacity to sell things to Americans is right next door in Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this huge trade balance because America is so huge and the Canadian population is so small that 80% of all goods manufactured go from Canada to the United States. And that doesn't sound to me like that Canada is winning in that situation. It sounds like they're in a position of economic dependence. So there's that. But he really does see it as, Canada is... And he does the same thing with the European Union or China. Like, anytime a partner has an economic advantage, that's bad for them. But in business, what you want is to have win-win situations because fair trade, can help everyone. It can lift everyone up. Fair trade that is responsible with people, with the environment, it can help everybody, lift everybody up. If Trump puts these tariffs on Canadian goods and Canadian services and Canadian exports, that means the prices for Americans will go up. And this is the thing. If Canada becomes the 51st state, then you don't need tariffs, right? Because they have this thing called interstate enterprise and freedom of movement and all that in the United States. So it would be really easy. It would be better for the economy that there weren't those barriers between different countries. And it's crazy. NAFTA removed most of the barriers, right? But if you put up tariffs, there are barriers again. And what's the solution to getting rid of the barriers and getting rid of the tariffs? Annexation, right? And of course, there's other benefits like a highly educated population, lots of land, lots of resources, but it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, the argument kind of makes sense to get rid of barriers, and I'll talk a little bit about how you could actually annex Canada if you wanted to do it correctly in a moment. But yeah, so the barriers are a kind of ridiculous thing. Like even in Canada, there are probably more barriers between provinces than there are between Canada and the United States. So it is an issue that this situation kind of highlighted, that Canada is weak economically, it's dependent on the United States, and it always kind of just said, well, you're our friends, you'll never do anything bad to us because we're so friendly. to you. And then there's another argument that Trump has made publicly, which is that, fentanyl comes into to the United States from Canada, but the percentage of fentanyl coming in from Canada to the United States dwarfs the amount going out of the United States into Canada. Same thing with guns. There's a bunch of illegal guns being smuggled over the border into Canada, which are used by criminals. So if anybody had problems with this open border, it should be Canada, not Trump, and not the United States. But it's a really, really strange situation, right? Because I don't recall any MAGA people saying ever that they wanted to annex Canada, that they thought that Canada should be the 51st state. Because MAGA people, all they wanted was that they, no immigration and maybe a theocratic state in the United States and no separation of the church and state. And that's what they want. Those hardcore MAGA people, that's what they want. And the people who are not hardcore but voted for Trump anyway, they wanted to reduce inflation. They were worried about the price of eggs. Tariffs are not going to help with that, but okay. I think that Americans are especially illiterate right now in this time and in this era. And that's another topic I could talk about for a long time. But back to Trump. There's many arguments, there's good arguments as to why Canada and the United States should be one country. One, you reduce all of those trade barriers that I mentioned. You have a free flow of people. You have more investments in businesses in Canada. Mostly, Canada is English speaking, but there is a big but to that, which is why this whole process would be really difficult, in fact, to do. There's a huge population of a huge population of French Canadians in Quebec, and they would not want to be annexed by the United States because, frankly, they're fighting for their culture, they're fighting for their cultural survival. They're an island of French surrounded by English people. And in Canada, they kind of have a little bit of a buffer because they have so many protections that are carved into the Constitution. Canada is an officially bilingual country. The United States, on the other hand, doesn't have an official language and never has and never will, but in practice it's English. If the Quebecois have a problem with Canadians, the federal government, they would have 10 times, 100 times more of a problem with the United States. So I can see the appeal of Canadian provinces joining the United States. But come on, the 51st state? That's ridiculous. That is so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that if the whole country of Canada was made into the 51st state, it would be the biggest in territory by far. It would be the biggest in population, I think. I think Canada does have a bigger population than California and New York, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But it would be one of the biggest in population. It would be one of the biggest in territory. That would mean, so many different senators, and basically Canada would control the United States if Canada became the 51st state. So I think that would be... Before all of this happened, I was thinking that it would be a good idea to do that because I think generally the future of humanity is bigger countries with less borders, with more freedom of movement, freedom of capital, freedom of ideas, freedom of religion, and all of that stuff. I think America gets that part really, really well, but it does that part really, really well, but the responsibility towards its citizens that the government should have, not there at all. That's the first part. The first part, why would Donald Trump want Canada? And partly it's just because of the tariff situation. That's it. No tariffs and this conversation is meaningless. But how could you actually do that? How could you actually annex Canada? I don't know how the American government would actually do it in reality, but I think that there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it. And I think the Americans, if they choose this route, and I can't believe I'm saying that, it seems so crazy, but if they choose this route, they'll choose the bad way, for sure. So the good way is that you develop connections with Canadians and with Canadian media and Canadian cultural institutions, and you say, Americans do, Americans approach Canadians and say, look, we have this idea. We think you would be great in our country. We appreciate you. We want you here. So they start this kind of cultural program of promoting this idea, right? Like, we'll be this great country, we'll be together, and it will be great. You need to do that for like a generation or two. Because for the Americans who are listening to this episode, Canadian nationalism is based upon not being American. And there's a bunch of reasons for that I won't go into, but basically Canada was founded as by people fleeing the United States or by people who wanted not to be the United States. That was the founding genesis. So you need to overcome this sort of cultural hesitancy and cultural animosity, and you can do it if you have goodwill. But if your president just says you should be the 51st state, then that's not going to happen. So that's the first part of how to do it properly. And the second part is that Canadians need to start thinking about the idea and having political parties which are devoted to the idea, and they would eventually say, okay, we want to be annexed into the United States. First, we need to dissolve the Confederation of Canada, so we need a referendum to do that, and it shouldn't be like 51%, it should be a very high majority, like a majority of a majority, a super majority, if you will. Like 75% of all Canadians of voting age want this to happen. They want to end Canada. So then they have the referendum, and then all of the provinces and territories of Canada would be independent if that referendum passed. So then you would have 10 provinces and 3 territories. So after that point, each of the newly independent countries would have to have a referendum approving annexation by the United States. So that means 13 different referendums. And some countries, some of these newly independent states, would probably not agree to this. And if they don't, the United States needs to be chill with it, because the moment they're not chill with it would be a big civil war, which I'm going to talk about later in the what really would happen. So I suspect that maybe Nunavut wouldn't agree to it and Quebec wouldn't agree to it, but maybe if the whole thing is done properly, every other province might agree to this. And again, they would need like a super majority of people to accept this annexation. So that's how it should happen. And this process would take, as I said, a couple of generations. So maybe like 50 years, honestly. Because, Canada, it's a young country, but it's a couple of 100 years old, the whole institution. You need to take time, and you need to have people's consideration if they want to change. And you need to convince them that it would be good and great. I don't actually see this annexation happening in my way or in Trump's way at all, because I think it would be bad for the Republicans if Canada was annexed, because there are only a few they're not Republican, because in Canada there's no Republican Party like that, but there's only one province probably that would vote consistently Republican. And sometimes they even vote socialist in that province. So it would be strange. It would be a very, very strange marriage. And basically it would be the end of the Republican Party, Trump's party, as it's consistent as it now it consists of for a generation, at least, until they learn how to adapt to this new reality. What would really happen, though, what is going to happen? You can't really predict what's going to happen in this situation because there's so many variables, and honestly, I think that there are still some people who will say no to Trump and Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro is some Trump advisor who said that maybe their borders should be redrawn between Canada and the United States, and I'm wondering what exactly he means by that. I'd like to see that proposal. Let's imagine a scenario, though, where Trump is not stopped by anyone and he says, okay, I'm the president. I'm going to sign this executive order saying that our troops need to invade Canada. And I know patriotism and militarism is kind of a religion in the United States, but let me ask those people, those Americans who are listening to this, let me ask you a question. What is the last war that the United States unequivocally won? So just think about that. What's the last war the United States unequivocally won? You could say maybe the Cold War. Honestly, it's probably like the invasion of Panama or the invasion of Grenada. So when the United States was invading a country, a small, weak country with overwhelming force. Other times, when they've invaded small countries that had their own overwhelming forces, like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, it hasn't gone very well for the Americans. And there's this idea that, the American military would be wiped out on day one because it's not very strong. And that's probably true. But there's another aspect to this. Like, let's just role play this whole scenario out. So Donald Trump says, gives the order for American troops to march into Canada. This is to further annexation, right? You can't do a whole huge shock and awe campaign against Canada. Firstly, because it's such a gigantic country, and like Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan are tiny, tiny, tiny countries in comparison to Canada. Like, it's huge, very big. So, first of all, there's no way America has that many resources to devote to doing a shock and awe campaign against Canada. But even if there was, then there would be no point in doing that, because if you destroy Toronto, if you destroy Vancouver, if you destroy Montreal, if you destroy Ottawa, those are the cities that are in Canada, and basically you've inherited a wasteland. I mean, there's other cities, right? But like, what would be the point of having Canada if you destroy most of the cities? It doesn't make any sense, because you would be the ones who would have to repay to build it again when it's already built and doing fine. I mean, maybe not doing fine, but there's buildings, they're standing, people live there, they pay taxes, etc. And so I don't imagine it would be a shock and awe campaign. I think that he would just say, American troops, go drive your tanks into Ottawa. If people start shooting, shoot at them. And I think loyal Canadian soldiers, I mean, this is crazy because they train with Americans all the time, but loyal Canadian soldiers would shoot back and Americans would die. Canadians would die. And I think in the beginning phase of this, the Americans definitely have the technological advantage and would probably win. So it would be like when the Americans took Baghdad in the Iraqi war. It would be very quick. It would be very devastating. Lots of devastation. And then Trump would probably go on television and say, yay, we've won. But it would be a Bush moment for sure. Because, as I said before, in comparison to Canada, the population of the United States is larger, the economy is larger, all of that by large factors. Canadians are not going to sit there and get shot. They're not going to fight a conventional war. It's going to be very asymmetrical because it needs to be. And also, Canadians are not going to be martyrs and blow themselves up because there's not going to be enough of them if they go that route. So what Canadians would do, or should do, is they would have not a war of killing, but a war of maiming. If the United States invaded Canada, if I was in charge, I would order the Canadian soldiers to quit the army, steal your guns, and bury them everywhere. And also, because of the illegal gun problem I mentioned earlier, and just the fact that a lot of Canadians have guns, just as many as Americans, there are guns everywhere in Canada. And it's pretty easy to spot an American. So what I imagine the resistance would look like would be a lot of denial of services. So Americans would come in and they would request to stay at hotels, and hotels would say, no, we're not having you. You can't stay here. American businesses would be boycotted, much stronger than is happening now, and they would basically stop existing. American soldiers would be looking for places to stay, and people wouldn't open their homes to them. It would be like a situation where, the British were forcing Americans to let soldiers stay in their homes, and the Americans would do the same thing. And because no one would work, no one would build bases for them, or there would be traders who would build bases for the Americans, but those would be dealt with. Let's say that euphemistically. I mean, it's horrible to talk about the deaths of human beings, but this is I want Americans to understand that it would not be a walk in the park. No matter how great you think your military is, it would be the worst possible scenario for everyone involved. And I'm just talking about what's going to happen in Canada, and then I'll get to other places. The resistance forces, they probably would execute people who were helping Americans, so Americans wouldn't be helped. And if it does appear that they're being helped, then they would be horribly maimed, because it would be a war of maiming people, not a war of killing people. Because a wounded American soldier takes 10, 20, 30 people out of the fight. And for Canada, that evens the odds. So you would have lots of IEDs, but not just this, it's horrible. There would be people who get soldiers who are lost, get kidnapped, American soldiers, get an arm chopped off, leg chopped off, fingers chopped off, etc. It would be brutally vicious, because it would need to be, because the Canadians would be fighting for their very existence. As a country, as a civilization, everything. It would be monumental. And for the Americans, it's just a war of conquest. And it would be the first war of conquest, so a lot of Americans would have mixed feelings about it. But let me keep you informed of what would be happening in Canada. So every infrastructure thing that is connected to the United States would be closed down, even if the Americans wanted to, keep it open, like I said, because they'll be owning this land eventually, so they want to keep everything intact. But bombs will go off, infrastructure will be damaged, and also Canadians will, because they look and sound exactly like Americans, will be able to perform psychological warfare on a scale unimaginable for Americans. So they'll be inventing rebel bases in the middle of the wilderness, and expeditions will be sent to track down these rebel bases that don't exist. So the very expensive machinery will break down, and those men will be stranded, and then they'll be picked off one by one, maybe not killed, but mauled, fed to bears, whatever. It's a horrible vision, I know. That's what's happening on the offensive front. in Canada if this happens. So it's not going to be all roses. And it's going to be worse in the United States because, as I said, Canadians look like Americans, sound like Americans, so there would be numerous false flag attacks. So Canadian groups would go down to red groups and they would sound like Northerners and they'd say, oh, we're going to blow up your church because we don't think that people should go to church, we're like anti-church. And then red states would be like, oh, the Northerners are invading us again with their like anti-church ideology. And then Canadians would go in northern states and they'd blow up pipes. They'd blow up electricity, like power plants. They'd blow up highways. They would make it impossible for Americans to move freely in their own country. And the more and more they do that, there'd be more and more false flags because they wouldn't be like, hey, the National Liberation Front of Canada is doing this. No, they would say that this is being done by Antifa, or this is being done by MAGA, or this is being done by whatever boogeyman of the day. And as I said previously, Americans' media literacy and political literacy generally has declined because of numerous factors, but it's in the toilet right now. So they would believe all of that. And then you have the second phase, which is the real Civil War, the Civil War Part 2 in the United States, which would be created. It would be stopped. It would be ignited by these Canadian partisan groups. And why would they do that? Because that distracts the invading forces. And then the invading forces have to go back to the United States to deal with this weird civil war that no one wanted. I think I painted a horrible vision of the future, and if I may continue to paint a horrible vision, there's two outcomes to this, right? There's the first outcome that Canada wins, and it's a devastated land, and it has no economic connections to the United States. And even if there were economic connections to the United States is engulfed itself in a huge amount of chaos. They have no trading partners for a long time. If Canada loses, then you would have English Canadian, depending on how the Americans play it, and if you invade a country that you've been friends with for 100 years, they're probably not going to play it correctly. There's going to be terrorist attacks all the time in the English-speaking part of Canada, and eventually that will fade over time as new generations come up, because that always happens with these kind of conquests, especially when you have two groups that are so culturally connected to each other. And then there'll be this romanticization of Canada's past, like there is in the South in the United States, and American media will portray somehow, I don't know how, but they'll portray Canadians in some evil way, like this was necessary because of blah blah blah, but there's no slavery in Canada, so I don't know how they would do that. And in Quebec, the French part of Canada, the terrorist campaigns would never cease, and it would just go on and on and on until the people there are impoverished and the Americans can have a genocide. And that's how that would end. Pretty dark. There's a couple of options, a couple of ways out in this scenario. First way out, don't do it at all, right? Because if you don't do it, then we don't have to go through these dark and dangerous scenarios, these dark corridors of imagination. Second option is, if you want to do it properly. Take the time to convince people that you are a country that is worth being annexed to, right? And you're not doing that. And the third option is the horrifying future that I outlined. It sounds, I know for American listeners, that this is going to sound like bravado and that the Canadian says, "Oh, you can fight the Americans. Oh, big guy, big tough guy." No, I don't want to fight Americans. I don't want I don't want Canadians to fight Americans. I think it would be one of the most pointless wars ever. I mean, every war is to some extent pointless, but this would be one of the most pointless wars. I'm just explaining this to Americans because they seem to think like it would be hunky dory, everything would be wonderful. Canadians would greet them with American flags. No, 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 no. It would be hell. It would be hell for everyone. So don't do that. Of course, there's the question of will Trump really do that? Because he calls Zelensky a dictator one day and then the next week he forgets that he called Zelensky a dictator. I guess, his way of policy making is just to listen to whoever last talked to him. In this case, I suspect that this Peter Navarro is the one that has his ear on this Canadian situation. But I think even he must have some inkling that there would be pushback to this. And there would be, on the Canadian side, pushback. And already there is like a campaign to boycott American goods and services in Canada and in other places, which is kind of what Trump wants. Trump wants to create sort of an isolated country where that makes everything is really self-sufficient, and you can argue with the merits of that. I'll say one more thing, although I've already gone over my 3 points. I've talked to you about why Trump wants Canada. It's because of the stupid tariff idea. I've gone over how you could do it in a more successful way, how you could annex Canada if you really wanted to. It would take a couple of generations of time and commitment and compromise and talking. And I've gone over the vision of what would actually happen if the United States decides to skip that step 2. It would be horrible for everyone, and I don't wish it on anyone. One more thing, though, before I finish. I've been reading comments about Americans, and they say, "Well, I'm so sorry, but I didn't vote for him." Too bad. Too bad. That is such an insulting thing to say. Because you say, "Well, I didn't vote for him, so therefore I am not complicit in this guy's actions." Well, you didn't vote for him, but you certainly didn't convince most of your neighbors to not vote for him. You didn't give them enough education to realize the dangerous guy that he is for them and the world, right? And you didn't really care when, like, you sold your country out to billionaires, and now we are supposed to feel bad for you because it wasn't your choice. Like, our country's existence is being threatened, and we're supposed to feel bad for you. Well, boo-hoo. We don't feel bad for you, and if you're drafted, it's not going to end well for you. It's not going to end well for anyone. I know this was a pretty dark episode. It's a pretty dark topic, and I think, Americans are LARPing right now, and they would be confronted with the reality of something like that if it ever happened very, very quickly. So yeah, no one wishes that. So, to leave you, there was a quote from Pierre Poilievre. I don't know how to say his name, but he is the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, which is not the same as the MAGAs, but people accuse him of being MAGA, but he sounds a lot more reasonable than MAGAs do. But he said something like this, and if you don't remember anything from this episode, please remember this, Americans. Do not mistake kindness or politeness for weakness, because you'll be sorely mistaken, and lots of innocent people will be hurt. For what? no tariffs. I think Canadians will be willing enough to pay for the tariffs anyway. And you should too. Then, if you have a problem with the tariffs, vote somebody else in. Do your job. Do your democratically bestowed job. Then if you say, oh, I didn't like the choices, there's only 2 presidents, we only have 2 political parties, make a new political party. Do something else, Keep fighting, keep struggling, whatever. Just don't say, okay, well, yeah, no, Canadians are going to solve the problem for us of this rampant imperialism. It's their problem, not mine. Your country, your problem, you solve it. All right, that was dark turn. All right, I've been Adam, and this is Leverton on Politics.